The year is 1857. James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, sits in the White House, already facing a nation tearing itself apart over the issue of slavery. Yet on the western frontier, another, equally volatile crisis is brewing, one that would consume a third of the U.S. Army and cost the U.S. Treasury millions. The confrontation with the self-governing, isolated community of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, in the Utah Territory. The Mormons, led by their formidable prophet governor, Brigham Young, had forged a remarkable empire in the harsh, high desert valley of the Great Salt Lake after being driven by persecution from Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. They had established a vast, interconnected commonwealth spanning hundreds of miles, operating outside the conventional bounds of American society, and, most controversially, practicing plural marriage or polygamy. To many Easterners and Washington politicians, Utah was an un-American anomaly, a theocratic kingdom defiant of federal authority. The stage for the war was set not by a clash of armies, but by a campaign of insidious, calculated misinformation. The central figure in this dark prelude was a man named William Warner Drummond. Drummond, a Virginian lawyer with a penchant for gambling and loose women, was appointed as a U.S. federal judge in Utah, a position he despised. He arrived in Salt Lake City with an instant, violent prejudice against the Mormon populace. Drummond lasted less than a year, but in that short time, he managed to craft a fiction so convincing it moved the president to war. Drummond abandoned his post in Utah, running off with a local saloon girl he had legally adopted as his ward, leaving his legitimate wife behind, a deeply scandalous event even by frontier standards. Upon his return east, rather than face official scrutiny for his dereliction of duty, Drummond went straight to the Buchanan administration and unleashed a torrent of fabricated accusations against the Mormons. His report was a masterpiece of political venom. He claimed that the Mormon leaders, particularly Brigham Young, were openly defying federal law, burning federal law books in the public square, intimidating U.S. judges, and forming a secret, militarized, destroying angel society, a group of assassins to eliminate any federal official who dared to stand against them. He asserted that the territory was in a state of rebellion and that U.S. officials' lives were in constant mortal danger. Drummond's inflammatory claims were eagerly corroborated by other disgruntled former officials and merchants known as apostates or carpetbaggers, who had been driven out of Utah for various illicit dealings and who had a vested interest in seeing the wealthy Mormon empire broken up. The critical and truly astonishing part of the story is that these reports, grossly exaggerated, half-true, or outright lies, were not checked. President Buchanan, desperate for a political distraction from the rising tension over the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Southern secession, seized on the narrative of a Mormon rebellion. He bypassed Congress entirely, and in the summer of 1857, he secretly ordered the largest peacetime deployment of the U.S. Army in American history up to that point, roughly 2,500 soldiers, one-third of the entire U.S. military, to march to Utah to suppress the imagined insurrection and install a new, non-Mormon governor, Alfred Cumming. This force became known as the Utah Expedition. The orders were given in secrecy, not only to deceive the Mormons, but more incredibly, to deceive Congress and the American public. Buchanan did not want public debate over the costs or merits of this vast military movement. As the massive army began its agonizing trek across the plains, the news finally reached the isolated Salt Lake Valley. Brigham Young was informed by sympathetic travelers and traders, not by his own government, that an army was coming to chastise his people. The irony was staggering. The Mormons were not in rebellion. They had been trying to cooperate with the federal government, albeit on their own terms. But the news of a massive, unprovoked military invasion sent a shockwave of terror and determination through the community. Having been violently driven from every previous home, they viewed this army not as a federal presence, but as a mob sent to murder them. Brigham Young immediately began preparations for war and a scorched earth policy, ready to burn down Salt Lake City and scatter his people to the southern deserts rather than surrender to military occupation. He declared martial law, forbade the army from entering the territory, and mobilized the Mormon militia, the Nauvoo Legion, under the command of General Daniel H. Wells. The war itself was less a series of battles than a campaign of brilliant, unorthodox guerrilla obstruction. Young's strategy was simple: paralyze the U.S. Army without engaging in direct conflict that would lead to mass bloodshed. Small, highly mobile detachments of the Nauvoo Legion, led by the legendary frontiersman Lot Smith, began a campaign of harassment against the slow-moving, heavily laden army columns. In a stunning series of raids, Lot Smith's men struck with precision and audacity. They did not attack the soldiers, but their supply lines. On one October night, they raided 3 massive supply trains on the Oregon-California Trail, seizing or burning dozens of wagons loaded with provisions, thousands of pounds of bacon, flour, coffee, and crucially grain for the Army's thousands of draft animals. The scale of the destruction was immense and immediate. They also drove off hundreds of head of cattle and horses. The U.S. Army, under the command of Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, who would later become a high-ranking Confederate general, was now stranded in the high-altitude wilderness of Wyoming, crippled by the loss of its supplies, facing an early and brutal Rocky Mountain winter, and with no shelter. The Mormons had blockaded the canyons leading into the Salt Lake Valley, daring the army to try to pass. Colonel Johnston was forced to take refuge at Camp Scott and Fort Bridger, 2 remote, desolate outposts where his men suffered through an agonizing winter, weakened by sickness and near starvation. The mighty U.S. expedition was effectively neutralized, having been defeated by a handful of raiders, fire, and the high-altitude climate, all without a single major military engagement. But the story holds a darker, more unbelievable turn. While the Federal Army struggled to survive, a catastrophic event occurred far to the south, one directly fueled by the fear and paranoia generated by the approaching army: the Mountain Meadows Massacre. In September 1857, a large emigrant train from Arkansas traveling through southern Utah was attacked by a combination of Paiute Native Americans and local Mormon militia, the latter disguised as Native Americans. Over 120 men, women, and children were brutally murdered, with only a few small children spared. The massacre was an anomaly, a singular horror driven by the terror and siege mentality that the U.S. military invasion had induced in the isolated settlements. The emigrants were rumored to have been antagonistic, boasting of joining the U.S. Army and allegedly poisoning wells. The local Mormon leaders, fueled by fervent religious and political hostility against the U.S. government they believed was sending an army to destroy them, allowed a terrible act of frontier violence to escalate into mass murder. The true involvement and accountability remain a topic of intense, painful historical debate, but the atmosphere of war created by Buchanan's secret expedition was undeniably the tinder. Back east, the news of the massive, expensive, and stalemated U.S. military expedition, coupled with the rising costs, could not be kept a secret forever. By late 1857 and early 1858, the Utah War, which cost over $15 million, a colossal sum for the time, equivalent to hundreds of millions today, became a political disaster for the Buchanan administration. Congress, furious with the secrecy and the expense, demanded answers. The president had been hoodwinked by unreliable, vengeful sources like Judge Drummond and had launched a war based on a lie. In a scramble to save face, Buchanan authorized two peace commissioners, Lazarus Powell and Ben McCulloch, to go to Utah and broker a surrender. The peace was brokered not by force, but by negotiation and, crucially, a face-saving arrangement. The arrangement was as strange as the war itself. Brigham Young agreed to accept the new federal governor, Alfred Cumming, but only after Cumming himself traveled to Salt Lake City, saw the peaceful, non-rebellious state of the territory with his own eyes, and realized he had been misled. Cumming was received warmly by the Mormons and was astonished to find a functioning, highly organized, and orderly society, not a hotbed of sedition described in Washington.